Good evening, everyone. I hope you had a good one today. I want to talk about my daughter's father this evening. And so, of course, I always start out with the fantasy version of what happened. And then I talk about what really happened. So, here's the fantasy version. He and I met on March 12th, 2005. I was living here in Pittsburgh. He was living in Maryland at the time. He's full blooded Jamaican, born in Montego Bay, Jamaica. And when he was 12 years old, he moved to Maryland with his twin sister. And they lived with his dad and his stepmom. When I met him, he was probably about 25. I was 11 years older than he was. And we met at a local downtown bar. So he came over to me and he said, "Hey, my cousin would like to meet you." And so I humored him because I knew that he wanted to talk to me, but I think he was afraid that I would reject him because he's like 5'6", I'm 5'9". And he wasn't quite sure probably if I was attracted to him, which I was. But anyway, I humored him and I went over and I met his cousin. I was not attracted to his cousin at all, not even remotely. But I was cordial and we talked for a little while. And then me and my daughter's father went off and had our own private conversation in another part of the bar. We ended up leaving the bar together. His cousin actually drove us around while he and I sat in the back seat talking for like 2 hours. And I remember his cousin drove us to this park. And wherever we were, we went too far in the park and there was a cliff. And I really thought his cousin was going to drive us off this cliff. So I had to direct him of how to get off that hillside and get us safely back to the street. So it was probably by this time, maybe 4 o'clock in the morning. So we had talked for hours. We stayed in touch with each other. We would call each other every day, a couple of times a day. And my cell phone carrier, I had a plan where you could only talk for free after 9 p.m. Well, I always talked to him way before that. And anyway, I racked up a phone bill of like $600 the first month that I met him. But I thought he was worth it. So after the first month, I really thought that he and I would just be sexual partners. So every time he would come into town, I just thought, hey, we could just be together romantically, and then I would date other people while he was in Maryland, and I'm sure he was dating other people. So a month after we met, I started the process of trying to become a Baltimore police officer. And every weekend I would drive from Pittsburgh to Maryland and I would take different tests. And so the one time that I went there, he just said to me, "Hey, why don't you just stay?" And at the time, I wasn't too sure that I wanted to move in with him. So I ended up living with a friend of mine. She lived in Laurel, Maryland. So I moved in with her. And probably a week after I moved there, she was like, "Oh, by the way, I'm moving back to Pittsburgh." So I didn't want to leave. So he offered to have me live with him and his twin sister. So I moved in with them. My son was living back here in Pittsburgh with my mom. He did not want to move to Maryland at all. He wanted nothing to do with Maryland. So I said, that's fine. I ended up not getting hired with the Baltimore Police Department because they said I didn't pass my psych eval. Go figure. Um, so I ended up getting a job in social services, which is my field anyway. And our romance was going along swimmingly. He was very doting. Our relationship moved pretty quickly. So we went from 0 to 100 really quick. I went from thinking of him as just someone that I would date whenever he was in town to now I'm moved in with you and we're in a full blown relationship. He told me probably within 3 months of us dating that he was in love with me, and we started talking about being more serious and like moving out of his sister's and getting our own place, which we eventually did. So I would have to say probably the first 4 or 5 months we were doing pretty good. I didn't tell him I loved him right away because I knew I didn't. But probably by month 5, maybe month 6, I did finally tell him I loved him. And then I found out probably month 6 that I was pregnant with my daughter. I found out actually on Halloween. So I had a suspicion that I was pregnant. So I'll never forget, I went to Dollar Tree near my job and I got a pregnancy test. I took it at work and lo and behold, I was pregnant. So I called him at work and he just was probably in shock. So we ended up getting our own place. Everything again was going along well. Um, After I had my daughter, things changed drastically. He became very possessive. When I was not in his presence, he wanted to know every moment what I was doing. If I didn't answer his call whenever he called me, he would call me right back. And then he would text me, "Where are you at? What are you doing? Why aren't you answering my call?" Now, mind you, I could have been at the mall with my daughter or spending time with his family. And maybe my phone was in my purse. Or how about I just didn't feel like talking to him at that time? He began accusing me of cheating. I am a very outwardly, very extroverted individual. So I talk to everybody. I mean, I can be in a grocery store line, and by the time we're checking out, I have your whole life story. That's just the type of person I am. So he accused me of being flirtatious, which I probably was a little, but nothing serious. But he began being very controlling, very possessive, very critical of the way I cooked because I didn't know how to cook Jamaican food. So he was critical about that. He was always downing me. "Oh, you're too flashy. Your hair is too big. You wear too much makeup." And just trying to control every aspect of my life. Um, I remember one time we came to visit my mother, and my daughter was probably about 3 months along, 3 months old, and so he convinced me that my mom didn't like my daughter because my mother didn't like him, and I began isolating. I lost contact with all my friends here in Pittsburgh. I only went around his family. Every day he was critical. And so I began to not wear as much makeup. I wasn't as friendly to people when he was around. I took every single phone call because I didn't want to hear him fussing. Um, he did not like paying his portion of the bills in the house. So I found that because I made the most money in the household, I began paying all the bills. And even though I would ask him every payday, "Hey, can you pay your half of the rent or utilities or whatever?" It became a problem. And so I did everything. Uh, I remember probably my daughter was probably about 4 or 5 months old. I moved out. I got my own place. I stayed in the same apartment complex as him, but I moved out. I found a babysitter in that same apartment complex, and she had a child care center in her home. She was wonderful with my daughter, and she had a daughter that was Tony's age, and he and the babysitter started dating. And I didn't find this out until I went to his job one day. And we had a Suburban with tinted windows. And I remember pulling up in my agency vehicle just to bring him breakfast and say hi. And I remember I looked over in his truck and I saw movement. And I'm like, why is he in his truck? He should be inside of his job. Well, it was this girl, it was the babysitter's daughter. And I was very angry. And I remember picking up a chair at his job and I went over to the vehicle and I was going to like beat this girl with the chair. But she took off. And it's not funny, but I'm looking back on it and I was like, wow, I can't believe that I was that angry. I was very angry at him. I remember elevating my voice and accusing him of, being this liar and this cheat. And, why would you cheat with somebody that's so close to our household, and why the babysitter, and just on and on and on. It was an ugly scene. And so we stopped talking. I wouldn't take his calls. I didn't go around him. He didn't see my daughter. And so probably a month passed. We finally started talking again. And I remember him coming into the house and he said something derogatory of like, why does my daughter hair look like that, or something rude, but basically downing me for not being a good mother. And I remember he pushed me and I had my daughter in my arms at the time. And I was just in complete shock. And so it was a downward spiral from there. Um, we ended up leaving Maryland and we actually went to Miami together, thinking if we get away and move to another state, maybe we can rekindle our relationship and be stable and happy. Well, that didn't happen. Um, he continued to ridicule me. He continued to put me down. Um, and I just left him and I ended up going to a shelter, a domestic violence shelter with my daughter. We tried to be civil to one another, but he continued to talk to the girl in Maryland, the babysitter's daughter. He continued talking to her. He was cheating with other women in Florida, and I had just had enough. So, what made me go back to Pittsburgh with my family was one night we were driving. I was sitting in the back seat with my daughter, and he said something rude. And I remember grabbing him by the neck as he was driving us. And I was hitting him in his head and just being very violent. And he was like, "You're going to kill us. Stop doing this." And I was like, "I don't care." I was just so mad and just not in my right frame of mind. And so that next day, um, I left Miami. But before I left, he said, "Hey, can I see my daughter one more time before you leave?" And I said, "Sure." Well, he ended up hitting me again. And I remember becoming very angry. And he took off with my daughter, took off in a car. And I kept calling him to bring her back, and he wouldn't. And I called the police. The police convinced him to bring my daughter back to me. And when he brought her back to me, I just went to the airport and got on the plane, and I didn't look back. And I didn't talk to him for 2 years. I didn't know where he was. I didn't care where he was. And eventually he came back to Pittsburgh. He got in contact with my mom. And we began talking very gradually. And I let him see my daughter again. And so we were okay. We were on somewhat of a friendly basis. And the one day I took my daughter to daycare and he walked in. I was picking her up from daycare at the end of the day. He walked in and he said something rude again in front of my daughter's whole entire classroom. Now, mind you, she's probably like 3 years old, maybe somewhere around there. And whatever he said, I just ignored him and I just continued to get my daughter ready to go home from daycare. And he snatched her out of my arm and he pushed me. And I got a PFA on him. And he wasn't allowed around me or my daughter for 2 years. No contact whatsoever. Eventually, he was allowed supervised visits. He didn't always keep the appointments. He barely pays child support. He's barely involved in my daughter's life. When he does come around, it's maybe once a month. He'll get her and he'll spend a little bit of time with her. He's a good time dad. If I ask for anything extra as far as clothing for her or money to get her hair done or whatever, it's always a problem. So I don't bother him. I don't talk to him unless I absolutely have to. Because I have discovered he doesn't want to be a dad. I'm a full-time parent. I'm a parent 365 days of the year. I love my daughter dearly. And to me, love is a verb. It requires action. So not only do I tell her I love her, I show her by being the best mother that I can with the knowledge that I have. So I appreciate you listening to my story. Peace, love, and blessings.